Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining me tonight. Wherever you are listening from, your bedroom, your living room, or somewhere quiet in the dark, I invite you to settle in, get comfortable, and let the world outside slow down for a little while. If your lights are still on, you might dim them or switch them off completely. Let the room grow calm. Let yourself breathe a little softer. Tonight's story is not here to frighten you, but to guide you gently towards sleep, wrapped in the steady rhythm of a true crime mystery that has echoed through the decades. This channel is a place where real stories are told slowly and carefully, almost like a whisper from the past. No loud moments, no harsh sounds, just a calm voice walking you through the darker corners of history while your mind begins to drift. And tonight, we begin with a case that has lingered unsolved for more than 40 years. A case that involves a quiet woman, an anonymous voice on the phone, and a mystery that still refuses to rest. This is the story of Dorothy Jane Scott. Dorothy lived a simple, steady life in California. She was 32 years old in 1980, the devoted mother of a 4-year-old boy who was the center of her universe. People remembered her as kind, soft-spoken, and dependable, the sort of person whose goodness was quiet but unmistakable. She worked as a secretary for 2 small shops in Anaheim, trusted completely by the owners. Dorothy wasn't someone who sought attention or excitement. She didn't drink, didn't go to parties, and rarely dated. Her routine was peaceful. Work, home, music from the 60s, evenings spent with her son, and weekends visiting her parents. Her life wasn't dramatic, but it was full of love, responsibility, and the kind of stability she valued most. Dorothy's world was small, but it was safe, and that safety made the events that followed even harder to comprehend. Because, slowly and quietly, something began to intrude on her life, something she did not invite, something she did not recognize, something that would ultimately consume the final months before she disappeared, before the police reports, before the headlines, before the mystery that would haunt investigators for years. There was simply Dorothy, a mother, a daughter, a woman trying her best to build a peaceful life. Before the night, Dorothy vanished. Before the police reports and the headlines, before the discovery that would come years later, there were the phone calls. They began quietly, softly, almost insignificantly. At first, Dorothy mentioned them casually to her parents. A man had been calling her, she said. A voice she did not fully recognize, but one that felt strangely familiar, as if it belonged to someone she might have crossed paths with once, briefly, without remembering the details. He spoke as though he knew her well, and that uneasiness settled into her stomach in a way she couldn't quite explain. But these calls did not stop. They continued, and the tone shifted. In the beginning, the caller sounded affectionate. He told Dorothy he admired her. He said he watched her. He said he loved her. And because Dorothy was polite and conflict avoidant, she didn't react with anger. She simply hung up, unsure of what else to do. But admiration soon turned into something else, something darker. The man began describing details about her life that no stranger should have known. He told her where she had been earlier that day. He commented on what she was wearing. He spoke about her routine, her movements, her habits, always in a voice that Dorothy described as soft, controlled, almost gentle, but with an underlying edge that made her feel as though she were being observed from somewhere just out of sight. What frightened her most was not just what he said, but how accurately he said it. One day he told her he had left her a present outside. When she walked out to her car, hesitant, scanning the area around her, she found a single, dead red rose on the windshield. It was not dramatic, not flashy, but it was unmistakably deliberate, and unmistakably for her. Dorothy's parents urged her to take the calls seriously. She did. She began to feel fear in moments that had once felt normal, walking to her car after work, driving at night, coming home to an empty apartment with her young son asleep in the back seat. She modified her routines without fully realizing she was doing it, coming home earlier, checking her locks more often, keeping the phone close at all times. But even these precautions couldn't ease the constant tension growing inside her. The caller shifted again. Now the tone was no longer affectionate, nor merely unsettling. It became threatening. He told Dorothy she belonged to him. He said he would harm her. And one day, he said the words that would echo in her mind long after she hung up the phone. "When I get to you alone, I will cut you into bits so no one will ever find you." Dorothy was not dramatic by nature. She was not someone who exaggerated danger. So when she relayed these words to her parents, they saw the seriousness in her eyes. She was terrified. But even then, Dorothy tried to move forward with life. She did not want to frighten her son. She did not want to worry anyone more than necessary. She simply tried to endure the calls and hope they would eventually stop. But they didn't. Her father suggested she go to the police, but without a name, without proof, without any way to trace the caller, there was little they could do. In the late 1970s and early 80s, technology was limited. Unless the caller stayed on the line long enough for a trace, and this man never did, the police had no way to identify him. Still, Dorothy tried to protect herself. She began attending karate classes, not because she believed she could fight off an attacker easily, but because she wanted to feel less helpless. She considered buying a firearm. She told close friends about the calls, describing them in a quiet, almost apologetic voice, as if she felt guilty for being afraid. The caller seemed to sense her fear, and with each new call, he grew bolder. His words became more personal, more invasive, more certain that Dorothy belonged to him. He told her things only an observer would know. Small details, but too specific to ignore. A bracelet she wore, a book she carried, the color of her scarf, conversations she had not repeated to anyone. These details made it clear he was not guessing. He was watching. Dorothy's friends began to notice changes in her demeanor. She was still kind, still gentle, still dedicated to her son, but she became more cautious, more withdrawn. She checked the windows frequently. She parked under bright lights. She left gatherings earlier than usual. The sense of being watched clung to her like a shadow, altering the way she looked at strangers, the way she moved through everyday life. And yet, she had no idea who the caller was. Not a single clue, not a single face, just a voice. A voice that slipped into her home through the telephone line, spoke to her as though he knew her intimately, and then vanished before she could respond. As the weeks passed, the calls became part of her routine, an unwanted thread weaving through her days. She lived with them, the way one lives with a dull ache or a lingering fear, acknowledging them without truly accepting them. Still, she did not know that these calls were not just harassment. They were a countdown, a slow, deliberate approach toward a night that would change everything. May 28, 1980, began like any other day in Dorothy Jane Scott's life. A morning with her young son, a drive to work, routine tasks in the small Anaheim shops where she handled paperwork, orders, scheduling, and the everyday problems that kept the business running smoothly. No one who interacted with her that day sensed anything unusual. She was her calm, helpful, gentle self, the same Dorothy everyone had always known. But like many tragedies, the night that followed did not arrive with warning. It slipped into her life quietly, the way most endings do. That evening, the staff gathered for a meeting at work. This wasn't out of the ordinary. The owners held them occasionally to go over inventory, upcoming schedules, and any issues in the store. Dorothy attended, as she always did. She sat with her co-workers, including two people she trusted, Pam Head and Conrad Bostrom. Over the course of the meeting, Conrad mentioned that he wasn't feeling well. A red mark on his arm had grown swollen, painful, and hot to the touch. "It looked," he said, "like a spider bite." As the meeting continued, the swelling worsened. The decision was made to take him to the hospital. Dorothy, always helpful and never one to hesitate when someone needed assistance, immediately volunteered to drive. Pam joined her, wanting to keep Conrad company. The three of them left the shop together, climbing into Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon. The drive to the University of California Irvine Medical Center was uneventful. Conversation was light. Conrad was in discomfort, but not in danger. Dorothy showed no signs of fear or anxiety. If anything, she seemed concerned only for her co-workers' well-being. When they arrived at the hospital, Dorothy signed Conrad in while Pam waited with him. They sat together in the waiting room for hours as Conrad was examined, treated, and given medication. Throughout all this time, Pam remained by Dorothy's side. This detail would later become incredibly important, because it confirmed something investigators could never explain. Dorothy never left Pam's view long enough to make a phone call. Despite what the anonymous caller would later claim, Pam would say that Dorothy seemed her normal self that night, calm, comfortable, patient. There was no sign she was being followed, no sign she was scared, no mention of any new calls. If she sensed anything unusual, she kept it to herself. Sometime around 11 p.m., Conrad was finally cleared to go home. Dorothy told Pam she would go ahead and bring the car to the exit so the men wouldn't have to walk far. She stood, smiled softly, and said she would be right back. Those were the last words her co-workers would ever hear from her. Pam and Conrad walked toward the hospital entrance, expecting to see Dorothy pulling up in her familiar white station wagon. And for a moment, they did. Headlights swung toward them in the darkness of the parking lot. The car they saw was definitely Dorothy's. But instead of slowing down, the car accelerated. It shot forward quickly, faster than Dorothy ever drove. The headlights were bright, blinding both Pam and Conrad, preventing them from seeing who was behind the wheel. Conrad raised a hand, trying to signal her, but the car never paused. It veered sharply to the right and sped into the night. Both co-workers stood confused. Not frightened at first, just confused. It was entirely unlike Dorothy to drive like that, but they assumed she might have been rushing to pick up her son, or that something unexpected had happened at home. They waited a few minutes to see if she would return. When she didn't, they eventually made their way back inside and called Dorothy's parents to ask if she had stopped by. She hadn't. Hours passed. Midnight arrived. Dorothy's parents grew worried. She had never failed to pick up her child, never disappeared without explanation, never left anyone waiting. They called hospitals, they called police, they called friends, but no one had seen her since she walked across the parking lot toward her car. At 4:30 in the morning, the fear became real. Dorothy's car, the same white Toyota station wagon that had sped away from the hospital, was discovered burning in an alleyway in Santa Ana, almost 10 miles away. Fire crews extinguished the flames, but the car was empty. Dorothy was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues inside the vehicle, no fingerprints, no evidence of injury, and no indication of who had been driving. The fire appeared deliberate. It was meant to destroy any trace of what had happened. But the emptiness of the car raised far more questions than answers. If Dorothy had been abducted, where had she been taken? If she had been followed, why had no one seen anything suspicious at the hospital? If someone else had driven her car, how had they approached her without Pam noticing? Police searched the area where the car was found, but the alley gave nothing back. Just scorched pavement and the lingering smell of smoke. Officers knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, and gathered statements. But few people were awake at that hour, and even fewer had noticed the fire until it was nearly out. In the days that followed, the mystery deepened. No witnesses came forward. No calls were made from Dorothy's bank cards. No trace of her clothing or belongings appeared anywhere. It was as if she had vanished between the hospital doors and the driver's seat, leaving behind only questions and a burned vehicle. Pam and Conrad repeated their account over and over to investigators. They insisted they had seen the Toyota with their own eyes, that they believed it was Dorothy behind the wheel, but the glare of the headlights had obscured everything. There was no way to know whether it truly was her, or whether someone else was driving with the intention of misleading anyone who saw them. Police began piecing together timelines, retracing her steps, interviewing co-workers, friends, and family. Every detail of her life was suddenly under a microscope: her routine, her relationships, her past, and most importantly, the phone calls. Because those calls, once a frightening nuisance, now took on a much more sinister meaning. If Dorothy had been taken, then the man who threatened her may have finally acted on his words. If the stalker had truly been watching her, he might have known about the hospital trip, an unplanned event, but one he could have witnessed if he had already been following her movements that night. And if he was the one driving her car, then everything in Dorothy's life had been building toward this one moment, a moment she had sensed but could never escape. But at this stage in the investigation, police could not confirm anything. There was no trace, no body, no voice. Only a missing woman, a burned car, and a family waiting in fear for news that never came. In the coming days, the phone in Dorothy's parents' home would ring again, but not with answers, not with comfort. It would ring with a voice claiming to know what happened that night. A voice that had haunted Dorothy for months before she disappeared. In the hours after Dorothy vanished, her family clung to the hope that she might walk through the door, or call from a payphone, or somehow explain the strange events of the night. Missing person cases in 1980 often turned out to be misunderstandings, delays, or miscommunications. But as sunrise approached and her car was found burning in an alley, that hope began to fade. Still, no one imagined what would happen next, because the first sign of the person behind Dorothy's disappearance came not from a witness, not from evidence, and not from the police. It came from the telephone. About a week after Dorothy went missing, the phone rang in the Scott family home. Dorothy's mother, Vera, answered. She expected it to be a relative calling to check on them, or perhaps the police with news. Instead, a man's voice, calm, almost casual, asked her a simple question. "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" Vera froze. Something about the tone felt wrong, but she answered, "Yes, I am her mother." There was a pause, a moment of silence that stretched just long enough to become unbearable. Then the man spoke again, with chilling finality. "I've got her," and the line went dead. The house fell into a quiet that felt heavier than anything they had experienced in the days before. It wasn't just the words that frightened them, it was the certainty behind them, the cold, matter-of-fact way he said he possessed her, as though Dorothy had ceased being a person and had become an object, something he owned, something he had taken. Her father, Jacob, immediately contacted the police, but the technology of the time made tracing such a short call impossible. Operators needed the caller to remain on the line for at least a minute, sometimes more, to trace the location. Dorothy's caller was careful. He was quick. He knew exactly how long he could speak before disappearing again. Days passed, then weeks. There was no sign of Dorothy. No leads, no sightings, no ransom demand, no clue. The burned car was the only physical evidence, and it offered nothing. Then the phone rang again. This time, the caller said something different. "I killed her," he repeated it, calm and clear, as if he were discussing something ordinary. Then he hung up. The pattern had begun. Almost every Wednesday afternoon, the same day of the week, Dorothy had disappeared. The phone in her parents' home would ring, and nearly every time the voice on the other end belonged to the same man, the same tone, the same control. Sometimes he said he had her, sometimes he said he killed her. Sometimes he called just to ask why they weren't looking in the right places. Each call plunged her parents deeper into a nightmare they could not wake from. Vera dreaded Wednesdays. She would sit near the phone, hands trembling, knowing it would ring, knowing the voice would return, knowing she would hear some new cryptic message, some new piece of torment, crafted specifically to keep the wound open. Her father began answering more often, trying to stay composed, trying to get the man to talk longer. But the caller was disciplined. He never stayed past the point where a trace might be possible. He never revealed anything identifying. He never lost his composure. Only once did he show emotion. During one call, Vera, exhausted, desperate, grieving, asked him directly, "Why are you doing this? What do you want from us?" For the first time, his voice changed. It became sharp, angry. He said Dorothy had cheated on him, that she was his woman. Words that made no sense. She had not been dating anyone. She had no relationship with any man. But the way he spoke suggested obsession, a fixation that grew entirely in his mind. Investigators later confirmed this was consistent with stalking behavior, a delusional attachment paired with the belief that the victim is unfaithful. Despite never being involved with the stalker at all, the calls were not random, they were personal. But the most disturbing call came not to the family, but to a newspaper. Several weeks after Dorothy disappeared, the Orange County Register printed a story about her case. The day the article was published, a man phoned the paper's desk and said, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott." He gave details that had never been made public. He knew that Conrad had been bitten by a spider. He knew Dorothy wore a black scarf that night and had changed it to a red one before going to the hospital. Only Dorothy, her co-workers, and the police knew those facts. This was the moment investigators realized the caller wasn't just a cruel prankster. He wasn't a random person capitalizing on tragedy. He knew too much. He was involved, possibly the killer. The Register reporter asked the man how Dorothy had supposedly contacted him from the hospital. Pam Head, who had been with Dorothy the entire night, insisted Dorothy had never touched a phone, never stepped away, never gone anywhere alone except to retrieve the car at the end of the visit. But the caller claimed Dorothy had called him from the hospital to tell him she was there. His story didn't match reality. But obsession does not require truth. To him, the narrative he built in his mind, a fictional relationship, a fictional betrayal, a fictional claim, was enough. The police tried everything they could to trace the calls. They installed equipment in the Scott household. They advised the family on how to handle the phone. They listened carefully to the voice when they could. But every attempt to trace the calls failed. He hung up too fast. He knew exactly what he was doing. And so the weeks became months. The months became years. And still, nearly every Wednesday afternoon, the phone rang. The content of the calls remained the same. Short, direct, cruel. He would say, "I have her," or "I killed her," or "She's mine." Her parents suffered through each word, enduring a level of grief few people ever encounter, the combination of hope and torment, repeated over and over with a precision almost designed to destroy them. Then, suddenly, in 1984, the calls stopped. No warning, no explanation, no final message. Silence. After 4 years of torture, silence. And only months later, human remains would be discovered, remains that would confirm what her parents feared most. For years had passed since the night Dorothy's car was found burning in the alley. For years of unanswered questions, of empty Wednesday afternoons, where the phone echoed with a stranger's voice. Of hope and dread living side by side in her parents' home. With every call, the family's fragile sense of stability cracked a little more. And with every week that passed without new evidence, the police had less and less to pursue. Life moved forward around them. But for the Scott family, time had stopped on May 28, 1980. That stasis finally broke on August 6, 1984. It was a hot afternoon in the Santa Ana Canyon area, a stretch of land marked by hills, dry brush, and scattered dirt paths. Construction workers were clearing a site, preparing for new development. Their equipment disturbed the earth, breaking apart the soil, pushing aside rocks that had been undisturbed for years. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, one worker noticed something lying near a shallow embankment, something pale, something rounded, something that did not belong to the land around it. It was a human bone. He called the others over. They pushed away more dirt. Soon they uncovered several bones, some charred, others sun-bleached, lying scattered across the ground, as though they had been disturbed by weather, animals, or time. The site was quiet, eerily quiet. Nothing about it felt staged or ceremonious. It was simply a place forgotten by the world, holding secrets beneath the dirt. When investigators arrived, they began a careful search of the area. They found more bones, some fractured by time. Then they noticed a watch, a turquoise ring, and fragments of clothing so deteriorated that their original color could barely be identified. Among the bones were also dog remains, burned, partially mixed with the human remains. Investigators were unsure whether the dog had belonged to Dorothy, whether it had died naturally and coincidentally in the same area, or whether it had been placed there deliberately. The presence of the dog added confusion to an already perplexing scene. The location itself was haunting. It was not a deep burial, not a place someone had tried to hide with great effort. The bones were near the surface, lightly covered, left exposed to the elements. Years earlier, in 1982, a brush fire had swept through the canyon. The intense heat would have burned away much of what remained at the site, destroying evidence, erasing clues, and making identification nearly impossible. Yet, among the scattered fragments, 2 items survived well enough to matter: the turquoise ring, the wristwatch. Dorothy's father recognized them immediately. The watch was one Dorothy had worn regularly, a simple, everyday piece she almost never removed. The ring had been a gift. Its color, its setting, its shape, unmistakably hers. Dental comparisons later confirmed what her parents already knew in their hearts. The remains were Dorothy Jane Scott. 4 years after she disappeared, she had finally been found. The confirmation brought a strange mixture of relief and devastation. For her parents, the not knowing had been a torment beyond words. But knowing, truly knowing, carried its own weight. It meant Dorothy was gone. It meant she had suffered. And it meant they would never again cling to the hope, however faint, that perhaps she might return. Police combed the area for any remaining clues, but the brush fire had erased too much. Bones had cracked under the heat. Any soft tissue that might have offered answers was long gone. Footprints, fibers, fingerprints, nothing survived. The medical examiner faced a difficult task, determining the cause of death. After examining the remains, the coroner reached a heartbreaking conclusion. The cause of death was undetermined. There was no way to know how Dorothy had been killed, no way to know whether her final moments were quick or drawn out, no way to know if she had been brought to this canyon alive, or if her body had been left here after death. The brush fire had taken nearly everything from the site except the bones themselves, and even those bore the scars of destruction. The discovery of her remains should have closed the case. Instead, it created a larger halo of uncertainty. The police reviewed the evidence again, re-examining the calls, the stalking, the night of the disappearance. They compared the timeline with the burned car, the hospital visit, the statements from her co-workers. But with no cause of death and no physical evidence left behind, the investigation had nowhere new to turn. And then something happened that made the case even stranger. After Dorothy was found, the phone calls stopped. For 4 years, nearly every Wednesday afternoon, The voice had returned to torment her family. But after her remains were discovered, the line went silent. No more accusations, no confessions, no taunts, no claims of possession, just silence. It was as though the caller had been waiting for this moment, as if he had known exactly where she was all along, as if the discovery of her remains meant his ritual, whatever it had been, was complete. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. The police believed the caller was likely the killer. The stalker who had harassed Dorothy, watched her, followed her, learned her habits, and eventually taken her. Someone who had fused obsession with violence. Someone who kept a twisted emotional connection to the case by calling her family again and again every week. Yet, without evidence, without a name, without a traceable call, the theory was only a theory. And theories, no matter how convincing, cannot lead to convictions. Dorothy's family buried her quietly. Her parents held a small service, intimate and heartbreaking. Her son, now 8 years old, struggled to understand why his mother was gone, why she had never come back for him, why she had disappeared in the first place, why his home no longer felt like a place where anything was safe. Decades later, he would say he had almost no memories of her voice, her touch, or her presence. He remembered only the idea of her, a shadow of a mother taken too soon. The discovery of Dorothy's remains closed one chapter of the story, but it opened the door to questions that have never been answered. Who took her? Why did they choose her? How did they know her movements so precisely? Why did they call for 4 years? And why did they stop the moment she was found? As investigators tried to understand what happened to Dorothy, they kept circling back to the same unsettling truth. The only solid thread in the entire case was the man who had been calling her for months. Everything about the mystery seemed to orbit around his voice. A voice that had appeared from nowhere, woven itself into Dorothy's daily life, and continued long after she vanished. He never yelled, he never panicked. His tone was always controlled, almost gentle, as if he believed he was speaking to someone he knew well. But beneath that calm surface was something deeply unstable. The way he spoke about Dorothy suggested a man who had built an entire story in his mind, a story where she belonged to him, where he had some kind of claim over her, where her choices mattered to him in a way that was entirely one-sided. These types of fixations often begin quietly. A stranger notices someone and misinterprets a small moment, a polite smile, a friendly gesture, simple kindness, and from that seed grows a delusion. The victim usually has no idea anything unusual has happened. Meanwhile, the stalker watches. He studies routines. He learns habits. He convinces himself he is part of the victim's life, even though the victim has never invited him into it. Dorothy had never mentioned any man who frightened her in person. She had never told her friends about an unwanted admirer, never hinted that someone was following her physically. But the caller knew too much. He described what she wore. He knew where she went. He knew when she changed a scarf. He even knew details about a medical visit that only her co-workers should have known. It became clear that whoever he was, he watched her more closely than anyone realized. Detectives looked at everyone around Dorothy. They spoke to co-workers and friends. They revisited her past relationships, searching for someone who might have become obsessed with her. They questioned customers from the shops where she worked, people who might have mistaken her politeness for interest. But none of these leads matched the very specific behavior of the caller. The obsession had lasted months. The knowledge was too precise. And the pattern of affection, turning to anger, was too consistent. Whoever he was, he didn't just appear suddenly. He had been studying her for a long time. The strongest possibility was that Dorothy had unknowingly crossed paths with someone who watched her from a distance and never revealed himself openly. Someone who blended into the background of her life. Someone who learned when she worked, when she left home, where she parked her car, and every detail he needed to maintain the fantasy he had built. The most chilling part was how careful he was. In 1980, tracing a call required the caller to stay on the line for at least a full minute. He never did. He always hung up within seconds. He always kept his voice low and steady. He seemed to know exactly how much time he had before a trace might succeed. That level of discipline pointed to a person who had thought this through, someone who was patient, deliberate, and entirely committed to staying invisible. Experts who studied the case years later said the caller exhibited every sign of a delusional obsession. He seemed convinced that Dorothy owed him something: attention, affection, loyalty, even though she likely had no idea who he was. Because she didn't respond the way he expected, he grew angry. His calls turned from declarations of love into threats. And when he realized she would never return his imagined feelings, his obsession may have shifted into violence. Even after she was gone, he kept calling her parents. Week after week, month after month, year after year. He claimed he had her. He claimed she was his. Sometimes he claimed he killed her. The calls were not random. They were ritualistic, almost rehearsed. The man wasn't calling because he wanted to be caught. He was calling because the fantasy wasn't finished. Speaking to her mother kept him connected to the story he had created, a story where he still had control. Then, after her remains were found, the calls stopped completely. Not gradually, not sporadically. They ended abruptly, as if something significant had changed. Some investigators believed he felt a final sense of completion once she was discovered, and no longer needed to maintain his contact with the family. Others thought he might have grown afraid that police attention would increase. And there is always the possibility that something happened to him: a sudden illness, an accident, incarceration, or even death. Whatever the reason, the silence after 4 years of harassment was unsettling, because it only raised more questions about who he had been and why he stopped exactly when he did. With no physical evidence left at the site of the remains, no fingerprints, no DNA, and no identifiable suspect, investigators were left with a voice and a pattern. The case never moved forward. Leads dried up. The trail faded. And the man who had inserted himself so violently into Dorothy's life simply disappeared into the background once again. In the end, the only thing truly known about him was the damage he caused. A young mother vanished. A family was tormented for years. A child grew up without answers. And the person responsible walked away without ever revealing his name. When a crime becomes a mystery, when years pass without answers, and a case turns into a story retold by strangers, it's easy to forget that beneath the headlines and theories, there are people whose lives were permanently altered. Dorothy's disappearance wasn't just a news event. It became a wound that never fully healed for the people who loved her. Her parents, Jacob and Vera, experienced the kind of fear that does not fade with time. In the early days, before the phone calls began, they clung to the hope that there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe Dorothy had gone somewhere unexpected. Maybe she had been delayed. They replayed every possibility in their minds, searching for a version of reality where their daughter was safe. But the discovery of her burned car shattered that hope. Something terrible had happened, and they knew it long before the world knew her name. When the calls started, their grief became something far more complicated. Losing a child is devastating. But losing a child while receiving calls from someone claiming to possess her is something few people can imagine. Every ring of the phone made their hearts jump. Every word spoken by the man on the line added a new layer of torment. They were forced into a cycle where hope and despair collided every Wednesday, where they listened not because they wanted to, but because they desperately hoped the voice might slip, reveal something, give them a way to bring their daughter home. Each call reopened the wound. The sound of his voice followed them into the quiet moments of their days, into the hours before sleep, into conversations with detectives and family members. Some nights they wondered if she might still be alive, held somewhere, waiting. Other nights they feared the worst but couldn't bear to say it aloud. The caller controlled their emotions with just a few words, and he knew it. Dorothy's mother aged quickly in those years. The strain of not knowing where her daughter was pressed heavily on her shoulders. She tried to stay strong for Dorothy's son, trying to give him a sense of normal life while her own world had fallen apart. She answered the phone every week, holding her breath each time, hoping that maybe this call would be different. But it never was. The voice never cracked. He never offered anything helpful. He spoke only to maintain power, to keep the family suspended in uncertainty, to remind them that he was still there. Her father became more protective. He watched over the home, guarded the family, and remained in contact with police. He tried to take each call as calmly as possible, trying to draw out information, trying to think like an investigator instead of a grieving parent. But the strain showed. No parent is meant to navigate the kind of torment this man inflicted on them. And then there was Dorothy's son, a child too young to understand why his mother wasn't coming home, too young to process the sudden emptiness in his life. He grew up surrounded by adults who were grieving. He heard pieces of conversations, but never got a full explanation. In time, he learned that she had been taken. He learned that someone had stalked her. He learned that she was gone. What he lost wasn't only a mother, but the sense of safety a child is supposed to grow up with. He learned too early that the world could be cruel, and that people could vanish without warning. As he grew older, he often said he remembered almost nothing of her voice, nothing of her laugh, nothing of the subtle ways a mother fills a room. Memory fades quickly when it belongs to a child. All he carried with him were the stories others told him, stories about her kindness, her gentle nature, her devotion. He knew she had loved him, but he could not recall the sound of her speaking his name. Dorothy's friends struggled too. Many felt guilt. They wondered whether they could have done more, whether they missed signs, whether they should have insisted she go to the police sooner, whether one moment might have changed the outcome. They replayed the hospital visit in their minds. They questioned the sight of her car speeding away, asking themselves again and again if they could have recognized the driver. But none of them saw anything clearly that night. The headlights blocked their view. The moment passed in seconds, and some moments simply do not leave room for intervention. In the years that followed, the story of Dorothy Jane Scott drifted into the public eye, but the people closest to her remained frozen in time. They held on to the few memories they had. They held on to the belief that justice might eventually come. And every so often, they spoke of her not as a case, but as a person, someone quiet and gentle, someone who worked hard, someone who loved her son more than anything. For the family, closure never truly came. Even when her remains were found, even when the calls stopped, even when investigators admitted they might never find the person responsible, the void remained. She had been taken from them in a way that left no answers and no fair explanation. Crimes like this do not simply end. They echo, they ripple through generations. They settle into the hearts of those who survive and stay there, reshaping the way they understand the world. What Dorothy's story shows most clearly is that the greatest cost of an unsolved crime is often measured not in evidence or theories, but in the lives left behind. Her parents grew old carrying the weight of a mystery they never asked for. Her son grew into adulthood with memories that felt more like shadows, and the person who caused all of it walked away unseen, leaving only a voice on a telephone and a lifetime of unanswered questions. With Dorothy gone and the calls finally silent, all that remained was the mystery itself, and it was a mystery that offered no clean edges, no final moment of clarity, no confession waiting at the end of a long investigation. What Dorothy left behind was a puzzle with missing pieces, a crime that resisted closure, and a haunting sense that the truth had always been just out of reach. For investigators, The hardest part of the case was not the lack of evidence, but the contradictions that surrounded every detail. Nothing aligned perfectly. Every theory seemed plausible until the next detail contradicted it. The caller knew too much, yet remained invisible. The stalker watched her closely, yet never made himself known in person. The night she disappeared, her co-workers saw her car speed away, but the glare of the headlights erased the identity of whoever sat behind the wheel. The discovery of her remains confirmed she had been killed, yet revealed nothing about how or when it happened. One of the questions that haunted detectives was when Dorothy died. They wondered whether she had been killed shortly after leaving the hospital, or whether she had been kept alive for some time. Without soft tissue or forensic evidence, there was no way to know. The brush fire that swept through the canyon before the remains were found erased any hope of determining what injuries she may have suffered. The fire also destroyed clues that might have shown whether she had been bound, whether she had fought back, or whether anything had been left with her that could point toward a suspect. Another question that lingered was how the killer managed to intercept her that night. Investigators could never determine whether he had followed her to the hospital, or whether he had already been watching her earlier in the evening. The fact that she had been with Pam the entire time, except in those final moments, suggested that whoever approached her did so quickly and decisively. He either surprised her in the parking lot or convinced her to get close enough for him to act. The absence of any sign of struggle suggested that she may have recognized him at least enough not to run immediately. Or perhaps she was startled, overwhelmed, and unable to escape. Those moments in the parking lot will never be known, because no one saw them. Then came the question of why the killer called for so long. Was he trying to relive the crime? Was he seeking attention? Was he trying to maintain a connection to Dorothy, even after she was gone? Or was he simply enjoying the fear he caused? Some criminologists believe he may have felt a sense of power each time her mother answered the phone. Others think he wanted to insert himself into the investigation, offering small details to show he was in control, but never enough to reveal himself. There is also the unsettling possibility that the calls were part of a personal fantasy, one that required Dorothy's continued presence in his mind. By speaking to her family, he kept her alive in a twisted way that satisfied whatever obsession had driven him in the first place. The sudden end of the calls raised even more questions. Many people close to the investigation believed the timing was too precise to be a coincidence. He stopped after her remains were found, not before, not long after, but immediately. That kind of timing suggested that he was watching the news or reading the papers closely. It also suggested that the discovery marked an ending for him, as if the story he had built around Dorothy had reached its final page. The silence felt deliberate, almost symbolic. Whether he felt satisfied, relieved, or simply afraid of being caught, no one could say. What they did know was that his disappearance from the phone lines was just as abrupt and mysterious as his first call. Detectives revisited the case many times over the years, hoping that new technology might help. They re-examined the phone records, but the calls had been too short to trace. They looked for suspects whose criminal profiles matched the behavior, but nothing fit perfectly. They considered whether the killer had been arrested for another crime, or moved away, or died. Each possibility made sense. None could be confirmed. What remained were the questions. And each question led to another. Who was he? How long had he been watching her? Why Dorothy? Why that night? Why the canyon? Why the calls? Why the silence? These questions lingered for decades, floating above the case like the faint outline of something unfinished. People naturally looked for patterns, trying to arrange the facts into a cohesive story. But the most honest truth is that there is no complete picture. There is no moment where everything falls neatly into place. Dorothy's story is a sequence of fragments, some clear, some blurred, some burned away, and they never connect in a way that forms a perfect whole. The tragedy of the case isn't just that Dorothy was taken. It's that she was taken in a way that left no path to justice, no clear villain to hold accountable. Her life was quiet, gentle, and filled with simple purpose. Yet she encountered someone whose internal world was dark, obsessive, and detached from reality. And in the space where those two lives crossed, everything changed. Even today, her case remains unsolved. Investigators review it with fresh eyes from time to time, but the trail grows colder each decade. Witnesses age, evidence fades, memories blur. Technology can do many things, but it cannot resurrect details that were never recorded. And so the truth remains hidden, held only by the person who carried it away all those years ago. What endures is the echo of a life interrupted. A mother whose son grew up without her, a daughter whose parents never found peace, a woman whose final moments will never be known. Her story remains in the spaces between what we know and what we will never uncover. It is a reminder that some mysteries do not resolve themselves cleanly. Some disappear into the quiet places of the world, leaving behind only the questions whispered by those who refuse to forget. Thank you for spending this quiet time here tonight. As the story settles and the details fade into the background, let your mind loosen its grip on the world for a while. There is nothing more you need to do, nothing more you need to carry. The day outside has already ended, and whatever waits for you tomorrow can wait a little longer. Sometimes true stories linger with us, not because of fear, but because of the unanswered spaces between what we know and what we don't. Those spaces are gentle in the dark. They soften as you breathe. They stop asking for attention, and they simply drift, the way loose thoughts drift when the world gets quiet. Wherever you are now, let yourself sink a little deeper into your bed or your chair. Let your shoulders ease. Let your breathing slow. You are safe. You are warm. And your body knows how to rest even if your mind has forgotten for a moment. If your eyes haven't closed yet, you might let them grow heavy. If you're already drifting, let yourself keep drifting. You don't need to hold on to the story anymore. It's already told, and it's finished for tonight. The room around you can fade, the sounds can soften, and your thoughts can loosen, one by one. This time is yours. A space where everything is slow, everything is gentle, and nothing presses against you. If sleep finds you now, let it find you fully. If you're still awake, let yourself enjoy the calm that comes right before rest. That warm, almost weightless feeling where the world becomes soft around the edges. Thank you for being here, for listening, for sharing this quiet hour. Whenever you need another story to drift off to, you'll know where to find one. Good night, and rest well.